Lovely.
Okay, so I'd just like to welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sherry Clagsbrun, College Guidance Department at Berea. So I'm pleased to welcome our students and our parents. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We are really very fortunate tonight to have Mr. Dory Schultz speak to us about SAT and ACT and college testing in general. Dory is the Senior Tutor and Training Manager for A-List Education, which is a college prep company. He knows the insights and outs, an expert in college testing, the ACTs and the SATs, and he'll be able to tell us the difference between them and where you should really be, what you think you should be working towards, which school test might work best for you. And also really what college testing has morphed into this past year. We know we're all in the middle of a pandemic, and like everything else, college admissions and the role of testing has been affected. There have been some major changes in college testing, and Dory will address those issues as well, and the ramifications that it has for you girls as we go forward now as we start the college application process. So I would like to introduce Mr. Dory Schultz. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Dory.
Thank you so much for having me, Ms. Clagsbrun. It's really a pleasure to see all of you, and I'm just going to dive in. But before I do, I want to make sure that you all know I will leave time for questions at the end, and please, feel free to hold your questions until the end if you'd like. But if things come up and you have questions that arise during this conversation, I deliberately set this meeting so that you could unmute yourself and speak. I'm absolutely happy to take questions. My goal for today is to talk sort of if, why, and how about standardized testing for college admissions. So I will talk about the things that you brought up, but I also really want to focus on what you should be thinking about when you decide if you even want to take these tests. It's an important decision, and I want to make sure that everyone is making an informed decision, because this is an important time, and it's a stressful time, and it's a time to be learning how to use your time wisely. So a little bit about myself. My name is Dory Schultz. I have a new job title starting next Monday. I've been in the tutoring department at A-List for the past decade now, and most recently my title was Director of Tutoring, and I'm actually moving away from our test prep tutoring into academic tutoring. So my new title is Director of Homeschool Services, but I'm still around. You've got my email address here. I've also put my boss, Sam, who's the Vice President of Retail Sales and Student Success here, so you can reach out to him. You can reach out to me if you've got any questions. Please don't hesitate to reach out, even if you aren't interested in going the tutoring test prep route. If you have questions, this is what wakes me up in the morning. This is what gets me up, is answering people's questions, dispelling myths, making sure that people feel really comfortable and confident when they are going into their college application process. So today I'm going to talk about the SAT and ACT, facts, figures, numbers, data. I'm going to talk test policies for this year's juniors is what's really most relevant to you. And in order to set the scene, I have to talk a little bit about this year's seniors, obviously, and the past. And then I just want to talk about who benefits from test optionality. I think if I were you, I would be hearing all of this talk of which colleges are test optional, which colleges are not. And I would be thinking, like, do I want to pick schools to apply to that are test optional? And if I apply to test optional schools, do I want to submit test scores? So I'll talk about those things. And then I'll talk a little bit about how to prepare for the exams if you do decide that you want to take these tests. So, and of course, leave time for Q&A at the end. So first of all, let's talk about these tests. Obviously, the SAT and ACT are assessments of college readiness. For extra credit, does anybody know what the SAT or ACT stands for? What it stands for? This is trivia. No answers. Anybody want to raise their hand, give it a shot? Going once, going twice. Oh, someone says, oh, I've got some chatting. Scholastic Achievement Test. Cool, good. Standardized academic test. I'm seeing some good answers. I have bad news for you all. This is a trick question. Both the SAT and the ACT, that's just the name of the test is SAT, the name of the test is ACT. They both used to stand for things. The ACT was the American College Test. The SAT was the Scholastic Aptitude Test, and then the Scholastic Assessment Test, which, if you hate redundancy as much as I do, really grinds your gears. But now it's just SAT, ACT, doesn't stand for anything. So obviously they're an assessment of college readiness, and both of these tests have benchmarks. So if you've taken practice tests, you should absolutely compare your practice test results to these benchmarks. For the ACT, it's a 21 composite, and then you can see these numbers here. I'm not going to go into them. And the SAT, it is a 480 in English, a 530 in math. I'll be using this acronym on the SAT throughout this presentation, EBRA. This stands for Evidence-Based Reading and Writing. And this, it just means it's the English test. So we'll talk more about that in a second. So obviously the tests act as an assessment of college readiness. They also have historically served as a very important piece of college admissions. In past years, and by past years I mean prior to 2020, most schools weighed about 50 to 80% of their decisions on test scores and GPA. That's a lot, 50 to 80%. I mean, that's a big range, obviously, but even 50% seems like a lot of weight to put on just test scores and GPA, because there's so many other things that go into your application, right? There are personal statements, there are letters of recommendation, there are all of these really important things. For all of you, you've taken these practice tests, you've taken the PSAT, you've taken the pre-ACT. So what these benchmarks mean to you is, if your score is a little bit below this isn't like a, oh, you're bad, you shouldn't feel bad, but it definitely means there are some academic skills that you'll want to work on in order to feel really confident going into college. These academic benchmarks, and these are statistics, this is not a rule, this is not your future. I'm not like reading your tea leaves, but statistically, students who meet these benchmarks are more likely to receive C's or higher in their college level coursework. So, it doesn't mean you can't get a B, it doesn't mean you can't get an A, but it does mean these are skills that you might want to work on. What's on the tests? Y'all have, all of you who are students have, taken practice tests. So how much calculus is on the SAT? Does anyone want to answer? Nobody wants to answer, or maybe I'm seeing some shaking heads. This is, yes, I saw a none. That's absolutely correct. I'm all about these trick questions tonight. There's no calculus. This is all really fundamental math. It's high school level, pre-high school level, and algebra, a little bit of geometry. The ACT will have a little bit of pre-calculus, but out of 60 math questions, you're only going to see 4 pre-calculus questions. So even if you've never taken pre-calculus and you get all 4 of those questions wrong, you can still get a really good score on the ACT. About 40% of the ACT is pre-high school math. So that's the stuff to really be focusing on your ratios, on percents, on averages, on understanding all of those pre-algebraic concepts, on understanding algebra, on understanding geometry. On the English tests, you've got grammar, writing skills, vocabulary, reading comprehension. On both the SAT and the ACT, you've got arithmetic, geometry, algebra, functions. The SAT has a no calculator section. You're not expected to do a ton of crazy, like, high-level calculation. In fact, most of these questions, you won't be doing any high-level calculation at all. The ACT has a science test, but you will not be doing any actual, science. Obviously, you're not in a laboratory, and you're not even asked to know too much science. You're really asked more about scientific reasoning. So more on this later. Both tests are about 3 hours long. The ACT is on a 36-point scale. So you are given what's called a composite score, and that's your average of your English, math, reading, and science test scores. And there's also an optional essay on the ACT. The SAT is out of 1,600 points. You get up to 800 points in English, evidence-based reading and writing, and up to 800 points in math. And then that's summed together for your final score. I bring up the essay because the SAT essay was discontinued this year. So the SAT is no longer offering an essay. Why this is important to you is because very few schools required or even considered the SAT or ACT essays up until this point. Now that the SAT essay is being discontinued, I would say if you plan on taking the ACT, there is really no point in taking the essay. There are not going to be any schools that are going to require the essay. I will be very, very shocked. I mean, when you start applying to schools, do of course check the standardized testing requirement websites. But my advice is like, don't worry about the essay. It's not going to be a thing for you guys. So now that I've talked about all of these scores, here's just a quick page of some average scores of schools in the general area. I'm not gonna focus on this, but I just want to point out these ranges. These are the interquartile ranges. So that means the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile of these schools have scores within this range. So a quarter of students, if you look at Hofstra, for example, a quarter of students have ACT scores lower than 24, a quarter of students have ACT scores higher than 31, but half of all students have ACT scores between 24 and 31. Same thing with SAT. Most schools publish these interquartile ranges, but some schools like Yeshiva publishes its average scores. You can see though, there are also different average scores here, right? The average score at Yeshiva is a 24 for the ACT, 1180 for the SAT, but for the honors program, it's a 32 for the ACT, a 1460 for the SAT. So this brings us to an important point. We're going to be talking a lot about test optionality and test optional programs. And even for schools that are test optional, not every single program is test optional. So if you have specific schools that you've already started thinking about, that you're thinking you might be interested in, do please, please, please make sure that you go to their website and check their standardized test requirements. This is as easy as just Googling the school name, standardized test requirements. Every single college and university will have a page devoted to this, and they will tell you what their policy is in pristine detail. Some of them can be a little bit confusing and hard to read, but it does say it. They will all say what their policies are. So, test optional. Test optional obviously means that SAT and ACT are not required. But submitted scores are considered. So this means they're considering the whole group of students that have applied. They're considering students that applied with test scores. They're considering students that apply without test scores for all of their spots. And different schools handle this in different ways. Due to COVID-19, for this year's seniors, for the graduating class of 2021, a lot of schools went test optional. A lot of schools, pretty much the vast majority of schools went test optional. There are some schools that, and this is still a fairly substantial number of schools, have decided that they're also going to be test optional this coming year, or they've announced, greater details. They're saying, oh, we're going to be test optional for 2 years. We're going to be test optional for 3 years. There are some schools that have said we're going to be test optional permanently, and COVID-19 just sped up that process. A lot of schools have not decided. So for your class, everything that I'm telling you about which schools are test optional, it's entirely possible that it will be different next year when you're actually, starting to think about schools. And it's entirely possible that it'll be different in your senior year when you're actually applying to schools. So If you get anything from today, sort of the biggest point I can say is when you're interested in schools, check their standardized testing requirements pages. It's very, very useful. I also put up a link here, fairtest.org. This is the most up-to-date list of schools that are test optional. So you can just bookmark this page, check it out. It's got a list of who's test optional, who isn't test optional, how long they're test optional. I would still double check on the school's website because that's going to be the most up-to-date, but fairtest.org is a quite a good website. Um, as I mentioned, there are some exceptions to test optionality. So this varies by college and university. You need to check the individual school's policies. Obviously, like some highly selective majors, accelerated dual degree programs, honors programs. Um, some scholarships are dependent upon standardized test scores. So keep that in mind if you're looking for scholarships, if you're looking for specific programs. Homeschooled applicants, that obviously doesn't apply to all of you. Student athletes, though, it might apply to you. If you are applying for D1 or D2 schools to be an athlete, you may have to submit standardized test scores. So even if the school itself is test optional. There are also two other things, and I'm not going to spend too much time focusing on this because they're all kind of subsets of test optional, but some schools are test flexible, which means they require or consider standardized testing of some sort. So like NYU is test flexible. They were test optional last year and test flexible, which means you could have submitted the SAT or the ACT or specific approved tests like IB tests or SAT2 subject tests or AP tests, or you could not submit any standardized testing. The SAT2 subject tests are also being discontinued. So that's not going to be an option for all of you applying, but do keep in mind that AP tests will be absolutely like important. They're important for placement. They're important for, I think they're going to take on an increased importance for admissions to schools. That's, if you asked me to make a prediction, I would say that's quite possibly going to happen. Finally, some schools are test blind. This is probably not relevant to the vast majority of you unless you plan on applying to schools in the UC and CSU system or UT Austin, for example. The California state schools, University of California and California State University system have gone test blind for the time being. UT Austin has an academic threshold policy. So and sorry, UT Austin is not test blind, but these schools in Texas and these state schools like the CSU system, if you are an in-state student at these schools, standardized test scores can grant you automatic admission to the system, if not to individual campuses. So does anyone live in Texas? No, I didn't think so. In the past, schools were not considered in the US News and World Report, which is obviously a place where a lot of students get a lot of information, and it's really important to schools to have a high ranking in the US News and World Report. But now that the CSU system and UC system have gone test blind, I think that it's probably not going to be factored into the US News and World Report. I think that they're probably not going to get penalized in US World and News for being test blind as they previously were. Mr. Frank had a great question. If you had comments on AP test scheduling options this year, I have, speaking of AP tests, talking about these test flexible schools coming back here, I have heard from the College Board that AP tests are going to be offered much more frequently this year, that you're going to have sort of like 3 opportunities to take AP tests. So I mean, those of you who are sophomores are probably not taking AP tests this year, but do keep that in mind if we're still, I hope we're not still in lockdown next year. I hope we're all back to in person and able to do things as normal. But if that's not the case, I assume there will be something similar, that there will be additional opportunities to take AP tests more frequently. So if you are applying to a test optional school, how are students evaluated without test scores? Obviously your academic record, so the grades that you've taken, but also the curriculum that you've taken. Not all grades are created equal. So I always have students ask me what's better, a B in an AP course or an A in a regular course. And the fact of the matter is, the thing that's better is an A in the AP course. Get the very best grades you can, really, really make sure that your grades are as good as you can possibly make them, and also take a rigorous course load. If you're interested in, more competitive schools, if you are not thinking you want to go the really competitive schools route, good news and bad news. The less competitive schools route are less competitive, but because of test optionality, uh, at least this year, all of those test optional schools received way more applications this year than in the past. A lot of schools have not even made their final regular decision admissions decisions yet. We're still waiting on some regular decision admissions decisions. So we will see once that data is out and once that data is published exactly how test optionality affected acceptance rates to, you know, all the schools out there. But historically, when schools have gone test optional, they have gotten way more applications and they have actually become more competitive. So keep that in mind. I'll talk more about this in a moment. Obviously, students are also evaluated on extracurricular activities, what you're doing in your spare time, on your personal essays, and on recommendations. So for these more competitive schools, if you're applying test optional, if you're applying without a test score, I should say, um, all of the above need to be outstanding, in order to set yourself apart because you're competing against folks with test scores. I don't want to go too deep into this because there's so much for us to talk about. And full disclosure, I'm used to giving 12-hour lectures to 6-hour days on the SAT and ACT, so I'm trying to keep it brief. But I can go on quite a bit. Um, so I do want to talk about who benefits from test optional because I think a lot of schools are framing test optionality as like, this is such a good thing for students. And the fact of the matter is, not to be cynical, it is a good thing for some students. It's not necessarily a good thing for all students. And even if a school is test optional, it doesn't mean not submitting a test is necessarily the best thing for students. So everyone should make an informed decision based on, the best information that they've got. So colleges and universities obviously benefit from test optionality. This was a study. The authors of this study interviewed admissions deans at 28 universities. This study was done just a couple of years ago, called "Defining Access: How Test Optional Works." And this is a direct quote. The recurring theme was that a major goal had been to increase applications. Schools went test optional because more students applied. This study from NACAC, and this is the National Association for College Admissions Counseling, they found that all of these schools that went test optional saw an application increase. And again, this is from 2 or 3 years ago. So you can see on this chart, every single uh, pair of lines, that's pre-policy is the darker line and post-policy is the lighter line. It's substantially longer in some schools. It's longer in all of them, but it's really substantially longer in some schools. That indicates uh, the application count. And so the lighter line is the post policy line, and it's really pretty pretty strong, a pretty intense effect. And for all of these schools that went test optional due to COVID-19, they saw the exact same thing. They saw way more applications. Um, Students with competitive test scores benefit from test optionality. I'll go more into this in a moment, but the data shows historically that when schools go test optional, average test scores actually go up because students with stronger test scores submit them. They have higher rates of acceptance. Um, Not all of this data is like completely clear. You've got to do a little bit of digging to find it, and I'm happy to go into how to do that digging and how to find this information for individual schools. But students who submit strong test scores tend to be accepted at higher rates than students who take advantage of test optionality. And I would be very surprised if that trend does not continue at all. Students who cannot take standardized tests due to family, financial, geographic, or COVID-19 circumstances. Obviously, these students are benefiting if they absolutely can't, but they've got other extraordinary academic or extracurricular bona fides, uh, as well as students who don't have great test scores, but do have these extraordinary academic or extracurricular bona fides. So there are a lot of folks who benefit from test optionality. And so the question is, who should submit test scores? I'll talk more about this in just a moment, but students who are applying for merit-based scholarships or honors, highly selective, limited access, or accelerated programs should submit test scores. Obviously, student athletes should submit test scores. And students with competitive scores. If you have a score that is competitive for the school you are applying to, you absolutely should submit it. The second takeaway for the day, if you take away one thing, it's check the websites of the schools you're interested in. If you take away two things, the second thing is for test optional schools, strong scores can help you, but it can't hurt you. Your score can't hurt you. So there's no harm in taking the test. The only harm is the time you spend actually taking the test. These charts, and I don't want to waste a zillion hours on graphs and charts, but you can see on the left, the yellow line is folks who did not submit test scores. The blue line is folks who did submit test scores. And you can see this top bar right at the top, need not met with gift aid. These are needy students who need financial aid. More non-submitters were not granted scholarships than submitters. The bottom line is, or even let's look in the middle line, need exceeded with gift aid. So these are students who had financial need. They required financial support to go to school. Non-submitters received less gift aid than submitters. You can see students who did not receive any aid, more non-submitters did not receive any aid than submitters, and students who did receive aid, more submitters got financial aid. So this pattern has held out in the past. I would not be shocked if it continues to hold out. You can see on the right, this is the proportion of no-need students receiving merit aid. This is just their admission. This is not even the merit aid at all. So non-submitters, the light line is students who got gift aid. The dark line is students who did not get gift aid. So these are grants that you don't have to pay back. You can see the submitter line of students who get aid is longer than the non-submitter line. Like, that's it. If you want to really dig into the data, there's something called the common data set. And you can Google this. Again, you can just Google common data set for any school that you're interested in, and it will give you the percent of students who have submitted SAT and ACT scores in the past, the number of students submitting SAT and ACT scores in the past, the percentages of accepted students. It's actually, each of these documents is about 30 pages long, so you can really get a lot of data here. What I was able to find was that for most of these schools, right, this is specifically for George Washington University, actually, somewhere between 52 and 83% of first-year enrollees submitted SAT and or ACT scores. Because about 7.5% of college-bound students take both the SAT and ACT nationwide, we can roughly extrapolate that approximately 74% of first-year enrollees submitted SAT or ACT scores. That's my napkin math. So take that for what it's worth. Wide margin of error, but it can't be lower than 83%. It can't be higher than 83%. You know, it can't be lower than 52. Can't be higher than 83. Couple more updates on the tests since COVID-19. Obviously, many administrations were canceled for this year's seniors. Many administrations have even been canceled for this year's juniors. Hopefully, this is not the case for y'all. Hopefully, we get things under lock and everything's safe and good. But no promises. Some schools are going test optional permanently or longer term. And again, this data is on Fair Test. You can look that up. The ACT does intend to launch remote testing. They've already been doing remote testing for international administration of the tests, but they have not yet launched it in the US. As I mentioned, the SAT is discontinuing the subject tests and the SAT essay. and accommodations have been affected by availability. So part of the reason that the SAT discontinued the subject tests and the essay was so that they could offer more regular tests. So hopefully that availability issue is not a problem for y'all. Any questions so far? I realize I've just been talking a mile a minute for the last half hour. I have more time for questions later on, but I wanted to take a little pause. Great. I'm just such a good presenter. I've just answered all of your questions as they come up, clearly. So I want to talk about preparing for the tests, and I'm not going to talk about this for a zillion years, but I do work for a company that does test preparation. This is a lot of what we do. So if you want to pick my brain, now is a good time to do it. My advice is to plan to take the tests if it's at all possible. Solid scores can substantially help students. It does help to a lot of schools. But test optional policies for schools that are test optional, that means scores can only help you, not hurt you. I got a great question here. Is it worth it to submit a test score for trade schools? So it depends on the school. A lot of trade schools are not going to require the SAT and ACT, but some schools will. So look that up. Like that's rule one. Check the school's admissions policy. Most trade schools will not, but some will. Check it, make sure. I know, for example, that of the schools that went test optional, West Point this last year did not. It's one of the few schools that is like, nope, you must submit scores. So some schools that are non-traditional, the Naval Academy, some of these military schools have not changed their policies due to COVID-19. So trade schools might be doing things similarly or differently. Someone else asks, would you recommend taking both tests? This is also a great question. I would very strongly recommend picking a test and working on that test and then taking that test. I would not, there's no real benefit to taking both tests. It's the only benefit is if you prepare for one test and then you also improve on the other test. The tests are similar enough that if you prepare for the SAT, you'll probably get better at the ACT as well. And some students do find after preparing for the SAT, when they first decide to prep for a standardized test, they think they like one test better. They do some prep, they do some prep, they do some prep, and then they just try the other one and they're like, oh, you know what? I actually prefer this other one now. All of the work that they did on the first test generally applies. It's usually helpful to that other test. So scores do go up sometimes, but there's no real benefit to taking real administrations of both. It's a very small subset of students who do that. Thank you for the questions. These are great questions. And please do keep them coming. The metaphor that I like to use for preparing for standardized tests is to think of preparing for these tests like running a marathon. If your goal is, I want to run a marathon, you can just show up on run day and you can probably complete it with enough willpower. You'll get through that marathon. If you want to complete the marathon at a fast pace and you want to improve your speed, you got to train for it. And there are about 3 different ways you can train for a marathon, as far as I understand it. I don't know, I'm not a marathon runner, but you can train by yourself, and you just motivate yourself and learn by yourself. You can take a group class, or you can get a private coach, and you can have a running coach really train you and help work with you one-on-one. And it's very, very similar for preparing for these tests. You absolutely, there are books out there, there are YouTube videos. If you're like the type of self-motivated person who can figure out everything that they need to do, you can absolutely do self-preparation. I think classes are more efficient than self-preparation because you've got an expert there to answer your questions. You get some attention from someone, and I think that tutoring is the most efficient way to do it. I admit that I'm biased, but somebody asks, is private one-on-one tutoring better than a group setting as far as increasing scores? The data that I have access to suggests that that is absolutely very strongly the case, that one-on-one tutoring improves scores better than classes. And I think that that's just explained by getting, one-on-one attention. And you have someone there to answer exactly the questions you need answered. You don't have someone giving you 1/20th of their attention. You have someone giving you 100% of your attention. Somebody asks, what grade should they take the SAT or ACT? Um, the these tests, most students take these tests in their junior years. It is possible to take it at the beginning of your senior year, but do keep in mind that dates can be limited if you are observant, because most of the tests are given on Saturdays. So you have to plan ahead a little bit. If you're observant, you have to, apply for a Sunday test. So keep that in mind. I would suggest taking the test in your junior year if at all possible. And someone asks, how do I go about applying to take a test? So in order to take the real test, the SAT, since you've already taken the PSAT, you should already have an account on collegeboard.org. So you can sign in there, you sign up to take the test. Those of you who are sophomores, I do not suggest signing up to take a real test right now. I suggest taking a practice test, and you can absolutely contact me to get set up. I'm happy to set everyone up here with a free diagnostic test to, get a score, see where you are right now. If you want to take me up on this in 2 months, in 3 months, at the beginning of next year, you're absolutely welcome to do that. This is not an offer that expires. But I would suggest taking a diagnostic SAT, taking a diagnostic ACT, seeing which one you do better on, seeing which one you prefer. And then in your junior year, actually signing up for the real test. As I said, the SAT website is collegeboard.org. The ACT website is act.org. Someone asks, do some schools require a specific test or do most accept both? Yes, every school that requires standardized tests will accept either the SAT or the ACT. It used to be the case that some schools would only accept one of the two tests, but that is no longer the case. There are no schools that will accept one but not the other. The one last thing that I wanted to say about ways to prepare is that, we've got we do offer tutoring, of course, and we also have recently started offering an adaptive platform. So it offers adaptive technology plus tutoring. So this is not something you can do for a marathon. Unfortunately, as far as I know, there isn't an app that trains you and also has you meet with a coach one-on-one, but this is something that you can do for the SAT and ACT. The data that I have here is about hours spent tutoring. And so this is just to sort of give you an idea of how much time you should spend working on these tests. So this is for students who have worked with a tutor for at least 20 hours. So, our average score improvement for the ACT is about 5.8 points. You figure if you're working with a tutor for 20 hours, you're also probably doing about 50 to 60 hours of homework and practice tests. So if you do plan on self-studying, I would say plan on self-studying for around 80 to 100 hours. That's if you want to see a really large score improvement. And same with the SAT. Our average score improvement is 150 points-ish, 148 points. So that's for 20 hours of tutoring, probably, 50 hours of homework. It is an investment of time. But if you're applying to a competitive school or you want to improve your score, it can be really, really helpful. I'm getting some more questions, so I'm really thrilled to address them. If you do decide to start prepping for these tests, the things that what most students do is they start prepping at the end of their sophomore year or the beginning of their junior year in order to take the tests in the spring of their junior year. That's how most students uh, organize that time. And somebody asks, if I'm going to be taking Algebra 2 in 11th grade, there's a lot of Algebra 2 on the test. When should I take the SAT, ACTs? That's a great question. There is Algebra 2 on both tests. You know, you will see this content on both of these tests. So that's why I recommend taking it in sort of the spring of your junior year, because you'll have covered all of that content at that point. If you take it much earlier than that, you might not have seen it yet, or you might not feel really comfortable with that content. Someone asks if we recommend taking both tests in case you score better on one test than the other. I definitely recommend taking one practice test of each. I do not think it's really helpful to take the real test, to take an ACT and a real SAT. I think it's more beneficial, you know, if you know which test you prefer, I would just focus on that one test. But what I will say is, if you do want to, you know, work on these tests, most students take the test more than once. Most students take the test 2 times. Some students take it 3 times. Someone asks, and I want to make sure everyone knows, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint. This is absolutely something. I'll send this to Ms. Klagsbrun and she can send it out. Somebody asked if there were specific review or study books that I recommend. Yes and no. So I'm biased for our own textbooks. I think that our own textbooks are very readable. I think that they're really good. There are resources for both the SAT and the ACT that are out there. And in terms of like free resources, things that you can just buy online, for the SAT, I think that Khan Academy's math is pretty good. That's a solid study resource, and that's free. For English, I also like Erica Meltzer, Meltzer. She's quite good at helping explain the English tests. And both the SAT and the ACT have a ton of practice tests. Well, the SAT has a ton of practice tests available online. It's kind of a hassle to score them, but you can see those practice materials. You can see the answer explanations. I do think like having an expert explain them to you makes things easier, but there are a lot of resources out there. For the ACT is, I think, a little bit harder to pin down like really solid resources for. This is just my opinion. The ACT math is a little bit broader. As I mentioned, it does cover a little bit of pre-calculus, but you really can't predict what pre-calculus is going to be on the ACT. You see things from linear matrix manipulation to graphing ellipses to hyperbolas to Euler's number. Like you see all kinds of things, and so you kind of have to, like, if you want a really tip-top score on the ACT, you kind of have to study the pre-calc in order to get those last 3 or 4 questions. Everything else, I think that doing practice tests is a really, really helpful way to at least get a sense of the tests. I second my Erica Meltzer for ACT. It's all the same content in terms of the content, but math on the ACT, it's a little bit trickier. There is a book available. It's called The Official Guide to the ACT. It's got 5 practice tests in it. It's available on, it's like $20 on Amazon. But I do think for the ACT that our textbook is much better than a lot of the offerings out there. Other questions that other people have? Did I miss any? I was asked for comment on test optionality and super scoring for the SAT or ACT. So full disclosure, my original PowerPoint for tonight contained like 7 slides on super scoring. And I cut them all out because I was just like, if schools are test optional, it's just not really worth worrying about. But I will give you a really quick overview because it is important to at least have an understanding. On both tests for schools that require, for schools that consider these tests, which is pretty much every school is going to consider them. The vast majority of schools do what is called super scoring. This is not every single school, but almost every school. What this means is that they only consider your best individual test scores. So if you take the SAT 2 different times, or even if you take the SAT 4 different times, they'll only consider your highest English score and your highest math score, even if they're on different test dates. They won't consider the rest of them. No thought to it. If you take the ACT 4 times, and each time you get a different high score, you get your best English score one time, your best math score another time, your best reading score another time, your best science score another time. A school that super scores will only consider those highest scores, and this is the vast majority of schools. There are some schools that will only consider your highest individual administration. So that means if you get uh, a top English score one time, a top math score another time, a top reading score another time, you have to choose which one you want to submit, and it's probably going to be your highest overall composite score. But most schools do, in fact, super score. In order to determine whether or not a school super scores, check their website. That's the key. Somebody asked, would they ask pre-calculus questions for the written math questions, not multiple choice? This is a great question. So the SAT has a couple of questions on both the no calculator and the with calculator test, which are called student-produced responses. That means it's not multiple choice. Most of the tests are fully multiple choice, but some of the SAT, some math questions are not multiple choice. Students have to write in and bubble in their own responses. So, if you think the answer is 2.1, you have to bubble in a 2, you bubble in a point, you bubble in a 1. The question, would they ask pre-calc questions for those math questions? No. The SAT has no pre-calculus on it at all. The most advanced math you'll see on the SAT is more advanced algebra 2. You might see a little bit, a couple of questions about imaginary and complex numbers, but you should probably cover those in your algebra 2 class. So the SAT has no pre-calc questions, and the ACT, which does, is all multiple choice. Any other questions? I'm getting such great questions here. This is really, really lovely. Thank you all so much for asking these thoughtful and interesting questions. Ms. Klagsbrun, did you have any questions or anything else you wanted to say?
No, I am like so excited. No, I'm so excited that this was such an excellent and clear presentation, and that our students really asked such very good questions, which meant that they were really like getting a lot out of it. So I wanted to thank you very, very much. It's interesting because I sometimes suggest to students that they should take both tests, even if they're prepping. And I think this year I've been doing that just because it's hard to predict if they'll be able to have access to take their tests all the time, because testing centers are being closed. But I appreciate your suggestion that really you should pick a test and really just prep for that, because I'm going to start following that advice. So thank you very much. I also appreciate your offer. Thank you much for the free diagnostic test for anybody who would like to take you up on that. And that would be great. Girls, you could speak to me also. We could arrange for you to do that. I'll help you with that. And then I really just want to thank Dory so much for such a wonderful presentation, and you girls for coming out on a school night, and parents for joining us. So much appreciated. Just want to make sure there are no other questions. Does anybody have any other questions before we end?
Oh, I see a question that just came in. If Israel universities require or use these test scores, that's a very good question. Ms. Klagsbrun, do you want to take that?
Yes. Okay. Israel schools do require test scores. For the most part, they prefer SATs. SATs is just more known to them. ACT has become, even though the ACT has been around for a very long time, it hasn't been as popular. It's just really over the past, I'd say, 10 years has gained popularity. and Israel's a little behind on that. We are trying to find out, and we do consult with Nefesh B'Nefesh to see if that changes. But at this point, I would say anybody who's considering school in Israel should probably prep for the SAT. Thank you. Great question.
Sounds like good advice.
Okay, Dory, thank you so much. This was really a very wonderful presentation. I appreciate it so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so, so much. And Ms. Klagsbrun, I'll share the slideshow with you, of course, and I'll share the recording with you so anyone who missed it can watch later. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. My email address is dorys@alisteducation.com, and Ms. Klagsbrun can also always put you in touch with me.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much, Dory. Have a good night. Good night, girls.
You all
Thank you.
have a
Enjoy.
great night. Thank you so much for having me.